These are African rhythms, passed down to us through ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Come on, move with the spirit. Stand up, clap your hands. Groove with the rhythms, get down, get off.
From WSNC 90.5 FM, a broadcasting service, an NPR affiliate of Winston-Salem State University. Welcome to Africa World Now Project. I'm your host and producer, James Poe. Today, we explored the African unconsciousness, roots of ancient mysticism, and modern psychology with Dr. Edward Bruce Bynum. Africa World Now Project is next. The relationship between spirituality, science, language, the political, presents a rich terrain to understanding the relationship between liberation, humanity, and justice. At this point in human history, no matter how hard those who seek to dominate, distort historical record, marginalize deep-rooted African genesis of human existence, the realities still come through. They are ingrained within the fabric of the African unconscious. Writing in African Unconsciousness, Roots of Ancient Mysticism and Modern Psychology, Dr. Edward Bruce Bynum suggests that the African unconscious is the deep bedrock of the primordial collective unconscious shared by all human beings regardless of race, sex, or historical time. Indeed, the African unconscious is the first sustained psychic structure that has come into the possession of humankind. Humankind's 2.5 to 3 million years of ancestral experience in Africa before its migration out reinforced the genetic basis of the African unconscious. Despite surface skin and phenotypical differences and permutations of other kinds in language, custom, and beliefs, at the depths of the deepest collective unconscious, it remains essentially an African human creation. Dr. Edward Bruce Bynum is a clinical psychologist and practitioner of Kundalini Yoga and author of several books of poetry, psychology, and has published numerous clinical articles for scientific journals. Dr. Bynum was the former director of the Behavioral Medicine Anxieties Disorders Clinic at the University of Massachusetts Health Services in Amherst and the winner of the National Naomi Long Madgett Poetry Prize for Chronicles of the Pig and Other Delusions. Dr. Bynum is also a recipient of the Abraham H. Maslow Award of the Division of Humanistic Psychology from the American Psychological Association for outstanding and lasting contributions to the exploration of the furthest reaches of human spirit. His corpus of work thus far includes Dark Light Consciousness, Melanin, Serpent Power, and the Luminous Matrix of Reality, The Roots of Transcendence, The African Unconscious, Roots of Ancient Mysticism and Modern Psychology, The Dream Life of Families, The Psychospiritual Connection, Families and Their Interpretation of Dreams, Transcending Psychoneurotic Disturbances, New Approaches in Psychospirituality and Personality Development, The Family Unconscious, An Invisible Bond, to name a few. To find out more information about his work, please visit obeliskfoundation.com. Our show is produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities of Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, and Ghana, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Enjoy the program. Thank you for taking the time to join us today, Dr. Bynum. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good today.
Good. Let's jump right into this conversation because the breadth and depth of your work is very important to kind of explore, because the way that we see your work, or the way that to understand your work, is that it is obviously centered in a specific understanding of a consciousness, an African unconsciousness or African consciousness. And then it spirals out into many, many different understandings of the world, such as science, physics, and, spirituality and things like that. Let's start out with this particular question. And it's going to be a very broad question, but I'm sure we'll be able to tease out a lot of what we wanted to talk about with you today. How did you come, or what is it that brought you to studying the African unconsciousness?
Well, actually, being a psychologist, I was formally trained in the traditional clinical psychology, lab work and clinical work and so on, and clinicians. And especially in graduate school, I came across and began to read seriously Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud. And there's the two pillars of what we think of as, quote, Western psychology. And I was sort of curious and somewhat amused to find out that both of them, in a backhanded sort of way, acknowledged the origin of their psychology to ancient Africa and Egypt. And I noted that not many other people picked up on that and ran with it. But these two guys, from the very beginning, said so. Jung said so when he talked about the collective unconscious, and he talked about his travels in Africa, and he talked about some of the seminal germinal ideas coming out of Africa, but none of his followers talked about it. And then Sigmund Freud, the same thing. He talked about the racial memory. He talked about ancient Egypt. He even wrote a book, a scandalous book, late in his career. Actually, he wrote the book earlier in his career, but he was too afraid to release it until just before he died, on Moses and monotheism, in which he said that Moses was not a Jew, but a black Egyptian priest. And I was surprised that nobody else picked up and ran with this. So as I began to study them, I also had a keen interest in anthropology, archaeology, and brain science, or neuroscience. And it sort of naturally led me to, well, what are the origins of human consciousness? And if you look at anthropology, acknowledged and accepted, and archaeology, humankind as we know it today began very, very clearly in Africa. There's some debate about whether it was East Africa, where most of the bones are found, or recent research has unearthed it in South Africa, going back and forth. But in either case, it is in Africa. And you find branchings in other parts of the world, but the entire sequence of development from the very beginning is found in Africa. So I simply put two and two together, and it's quite clear that, Africa is the origin of our species. It's also the origin of the human consciousness, deeper than surface individual takes on it. This ethnic group, that ethnic group, this supposed race, that supposed race. No, deep, deep, deep down, it's all clearly an African-rooted phenomenon. And so that's where the idea simply came from, and all I did was flesh it out. It was pretty obvious, at least obvious to me.
And that's very important, because that leads us right to the next important question that I think, as a person who studies a critical consciousness, because a lot of the work that I look at is how do groups and individuals develop a critical consciousness to address their particular situations. But before we move right into that, why is it important to understand the origins of consciousness, or even the origins of understanding psychology or psychiatry?
Well, it is important to understand because you want to know what the basis, the roots, the fundamental assumptions, the basic tenets of the field that you're studying. Now, the origin of something is not identical. Underline this. It is not identical to the meaning of something. But the origin of something tells you an enormous amount about what is possible and what is not possible. And the origin of human consciousness, beneath all the different sub-variations, derivations, is an African phenomenon. The human species is inherently an African species, and it has differentiated in many other ways, but seriologically, in other words, the blood work, the DNA, the genetics, anthropologically speaking and archaeologically speaking, it's rooted there. And this would not have been such a horrific idea, 2,000 years ago. I mean, we didn't have the kind of tensions between so-called races as we did. There were different ethnic groups that fought each other, but it wasn't necessarily about so-called race or skin color. It was about nationality and so on and so forth. Because it's like in ancient Rome, half the religions of ancient Rome were African religions. They were. And the same with Greece. The ancient Greeks, acknowledged, in many cases, the origin of their civilization. The origin of their civilization is coming from the south, meaning Egypt. And the graduate school for the great Romans during the Roman Empire and during the Greek ages was Egypt. So you didn't have that animosity that we have today. That animosity that we have today arose largely beginning in medieval Europe, and it really, really, really ramped up during the slave trade in the West, because it got really dicey. You can't be acknowledging your civilization to people who you have enslaved. It creates a psychological disturbance in the field, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So you have to do all kinds of internal psychological tricks to flip it around. But that is historically what happened. So in this day and age where we are at each other's throats cyclically again, people are always talking about bringing us together, what unites us. Well, this is something that unites us. It's very deep. But as you well know, there are many people who are very frightened of this because it doesn't fit into their self-image.
And I wanted to pull on your thought here, because one of the things that you said in the opening statements, or in the opening answer to the question that I posed, you talked about this idea of a human consciousness that is found through what is termed what we agreed to be Africa, an African consciousness. And then you just talked about the mental acrobatics, so to speak, that one has to do to enslave another person, because again, we have this concept or this idea of a human, right? But then you have the differentiations that come through European epistemology and cosmological understanding of the world, and to kind of differentiate those. Could you talk a little bit about those particular processes of the mental acrobatics to what one has to do to enslave another group of people?
Well, you have to dehumanize them. You have to limit them. I'll give you a very clear historical and in some cases academic historical example. Up until around the early 1700s, for European scholars, their ideal of what a civilization was the same as in the European Renaissance, and that was Egypt. They glorified Egypt. That was the model of civilization. If you read the texts up until that time, early 1700s, it was Egypt. Egypt was a model of civilization. Well, then a very inconvenient thing happened. Napoleon invaded Egypt during one of his campaigns, and he got to Egypt, and going up and down the Nile, all he saw was black people. And it created a huge conflict for the French and those in the so-called Enlightenment, because it was quite clear that civilization that they glorified so much, Egypt, was actually a black phenomenon. The Sphinx has the visage of clearly an African image. That's what that Sphinx looks like if he's reconstructed. That is what the visage is. And so, this was also at the height of the slave trade. So all of a sudden, no longer was Egypt model of civilization. The European scholars all of a sudden dropped it, and the ideal became ancient India. All of a sudden they became interested in India, because India, we did not have Indian slaves in the U.S. of A. You had African slaves in the U.S. of A. And that was easier to digest. Not everybody. There were examples. Count Volney wrote a book, The Ruins of Empires, in which he acknowledged clearly these people that we've enslaved are the origins of our civilization. So those are the kind of mental gymnastics that had to be done in order to justify enslaving. Another example, when the Spanish and the Portuguese came to the west coast of Africa and they began to get involved with the slave trade, a slave trade, by the way, that was introduced to them, first of all, by the Arabs who invaded those parts of Africa and were involved in the slave trade. The Europeans came in, saw how profitable it was, and got into the game. So everybody was some degree of complicity in this, and that is how it sort of gathered and took on a life of its own. And the Portuguese and the Spanish, they knew that the Africans had souls. They couldn't take that away. They knew they had souls. Benighted souls, perhaps. Inferior souls, perhaps. Souls that need to be educated, perhaps. But they nevertheless had an immortal soul. So the gymnastics, the psychological gymnastics was that a bargain was struck. And getting on the slave ships, they would have the priest blessing those who were taken over in slavery. And the cost of your enslavement is I'm blessing you and sanctifying your soul. Those are the kind of mental gymnastics I'm talking about. And that was quite common. It was quite common for millions and millions of people.
So, Dr. Bynum, you talked a lot about, so African civilization really becomes the template for civilization, for human civilizations. And
the civilizations that we know in our era, yes.
Right. And this sort of deep, the psychic and intellectual energies that were put into really repressing this understanding, sort of this African genesis that you talked about a lot in the African unconscious. And I wanted to kind of maybe move in a little bit of a different direction in the sense of, like, what are the deep psychic implications and implications to our consciousness in terms of this sort of deep repression?
Well, let me put it in a tragic a modern context. How difficult would it be for half the newscasters at Fox News, or for the current President of the United States, Trump, or for many quote-unquote diehard conservatives, unquote, to acknowledge that in their deepest core they have African blood, African bones, African history, African consciousness? How easy do you think it would be to do that? Exactly. Pretty difficult. And they would be at war. They would have to acknowledge a deep and profound war with themselves. A deep and profound war with themselves. That is one of the ways we keep it at a distance. It is the deep, threatened return of the repressed, as we say in psychiatry and psychology. That African consciousness. Now, that is not across the world. That is not across the world. In some places, it's much less repressed, and it's quasi-integrated. Give you an example. In South America and the Caribbean, the dynamics of race were pretty violent, and still are, but in a different kind of way. And there was a lot of intermixing and interbreeding in South America and in the Caribbean, because of the nature of the populations, where the populations came from, and so forth. And in the Protestant North American context, there was more of a clear need to keep a distance, whereas in South America and the Caribbean, it was for historical reasons and otherwise, it was different. You have to remember, in South America, it was conquered primarily by the Spanish and the Portuguese, and For 700 years, the Spanish and the Portuguese had an intense African presence in their own homeland on the Iberian Peninsula due to the Moorish invasions from North and Northwest Africa. So they were familiar with it in a different kind of way. So the dynamics were different. Plus, and this is very important, many of the religions of South America and the Caribbean are syncretic integration, quote-unquote integration, of West African and Central African religious currents and those of Catholicism. And you find that in some parts of the southern United States also, Louisiana in particular, and South Carolina, and Mississippi, and so forth. But you don't find that as much anywhere near in the Protestant denominations of Christianity. So these are some of the differences, and it plays itself out even today.
I wanted to piggyback on that response as well, because obviously we can also push this further as well, because you mentioned how it is synchronized through the cultural fabric of religious products or religious the conditions within religion in the African diaspora, in the Caribbean and Latin America, and also in the South. And one of the things that I think is important, specifically in your work, the African Unconsciousness, but you also see this developed in the other parts of your work as well. We often talk about and trace and map, the cultural and the historical continuities of Africa, our communities on the continent of Africa, on this landmass we call Africa. But one of the things that I think that is very interesting and novel about your work is that you also really kind of map or call attention to that the mind, the African mind, also is important to understand as well, right? Yeah. So what is African unconsciousness? How are we to understand that as you define it or as you study it?
When I'm talking about African unconsciousness, I'm talking essentially about the collective unconscious of all human beings. The collective unconscious of all human beings. And the collective unconscious, the deep collective unconscious of all human beings is the same. Whether you are raised and born in Sweden, in China, Beijing, in Mexico City, in Accra, Ghana, or the tip of South America. If you are a human being, you come into this world with certain tenets literally rooted into your neurological structure. And part of that is, some of it is the capacity for language, yes. The capacity for logic, yes. The capacity for certain kinds of analysis, yes, and so on. All of that stems out of a structure of our brains and our minds that were developed over about 4 to 5 million years. Underline that, 4 to 5 million years in Africa. And then, approximately 50,000 years ago, human beings, after moving out of Africa, hominids in various places to parts of the world, began to undergo changes. In other words, African types left Africa and went up through the eastern coast on into Arabia and over to India and Australia. Others went up and over into Europe. Wherever they went initially, they all looked African. And then began to go through surface phenotypical changes to adapt to the climate of necessity. You move up into Europe, it's much colder, so the surface of the body begins to develop more hair covering it. The hair gets longer. The eyes on the surface begin to change because it's easier and better adapted for blue eyes to see in misty climates. The body gets thicker, as I said before. The hair gets longer, to cover the body. And this is all adaptive. This is all adaptive. But in the deep core, it is the same genetics. And human beings only began to go through our current, what looks like ethnic differentiations, only about 50,000 years or so ago, 35 to 50,000 years ago. Up until that time, they all looked Africoid. So for about 4 million years, up until the last 50,000, everybody, that was it. That was it. Now, there are about 5 different, I'm sure you know this, but there are about 5 different ethnic types, quote-unquote types, in Africa. But they all share the same thing. Just like Europe has different kinds of ethnic groups, but they're all, quote-unquote, white, unquote. Well, in Africa, there are 4 or 5 different, depending on who you classification you like, different kinds of Africans, but they all share that. And I'm saying on the deepest level, on all those groups, it comes out of that African template, the capacity for language, the capacity for music, the capacity for analysis, the capacity for perception of certain kinds of phenomena comes out of that biological template. So that's what I'm talking about when I say the African unconscious.
And that's a very important distinction, because there was a number of things that you said there that hopefully we can kind of tease out a little bit here, because I'm thinking here within the context of moving into another frame of reference along the same lines that we've been talking about now, understanding the principles, and I'm using the term principles as opposed to laws, because when we think about spiritual systems and religious systems and their transference across time and space, but also across geographical landmass, how important it is to understand the influences of these particular conditions on folk understanding. Is there understanding whether there is a difference between religious and spirituality? And if so, why is it important to understand those principles of this human understanding of the world?
Well, at the root of human spirituality, across all the traditions, all the deep meditative, contemplative, religious traditions, there is an affinity between religious experience, spiritual experience, and the perception of light. And I do mean light. I mean light. And what is that rooted in? What is that about? What is there about the human nervous system, regardless of where you are on the planet, that is responsive to this notion, to this sensation, to this perception of life and light pervading what we see in the world? Well, it just so happens that in embryology, in human embryology, mammalian also, but certainly reaches its highest peak in mammalian embryology, when we're developing in our mother's womb, the first thing to emerge in the little, it's not even really a fetus yet, but prior to the fetus, there's a little line that develops that carries energy along it, that later elongates into the spinal line, then elongates into different organ systems of the emerging fetus, and so on and so forth. And it's very intricate. Well, that line just happens to be a line that conducts energy based upon the capacity of a universal, that is, melanin and neuromelanin. Why? Because it's dark and it absorbs light. It literally absorbs photons. It literally absorbs light and photons and transduces it to higher and higher and higher levels of organization. And that is essentially what embryology or development in our mother's womb is about. And it gets infinitely more complex. It gives rise to our spinal line, our brain, all of our brain structures, and including our higher brain structures of our cerebral cortex. And the human brain is littered on the surface and in key places inside of the brain with these areas of neuromelanin, brain melanin, not to be confused with skin or surface melanin. That is a surface phenomenon that's significant and important, but it's got nothing to do, absolutely nothing to do, with intelligence. Nothing.
We are currently talking with Dr. Edward Bruce Bynum. We are expanding and exploring the ideas he presents in his work, The African Unconscious, Roots of Ancient Mysticism and Modern Psychology. Dr. Edward Bruce Bynum is a clinical psychologist and practitioner of kundalini yoga, and author of several books of poetry, psychology, and has published numerous clinical articles for scientific journals. Dr. Bynum was the former director of the Behavioral Medicine Anxieties Disorders Clinic at the University of Massachusetts Health Services in Amherst, and the winner of the National Naomi Long Madgett Poetry Prize for Chronicles of the Pig and Other Delusions. Dr. Bynum is also a recipient of the Abraham H. Maslow's Award of the Division of Humanistic Psychology from the American Psychological Association for outstanding and lasting contributions to the exploration of the furthest reaches of human spirit. His corpus of work thus far includes Dark Light Consciousness, Melanin, Serpent Power, and the Illuminous Matrix of Reality, The Roots of Transcendence, The African Unconscious, Roots of Ancient Mysticism and Modern Psychology, The Dream Life of Families, to name a few. He is producer of a 10-part audio lecture series on science, psychology, spirituality, and African psycho-historical and philosophical systems. He is a frequent speaker at national and international conferences and has appeared on radio, television, and documentaries. His research interests include depth psychology as it pertains to neuroscience, neuromelanin, consciousness research, as well as the analysis of dreams, family dynamics, ancient history, anthropology, archaeology, and yoga. Dr. Bynum's work can be found at Cosimo Books or through his website, obeliskfoundation.com. Our show is produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities of Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, and Ghana, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Please continue to enjoy the program.
Surface melanin. That is a surface phenomenon that's that's significant and important, but it's got nothing to do, absolutely nothing to do with intelligence, nothing, or race. No, this is a biological phenomenon rooted in our species that comes out of Africa that is true for all people. Well, this melanin, neuromelanin, I should say brain melanin, it is responsive to light. It is responsive to light. You know, the surface of the brain is inside of the skull. Sunlight doesn't get to it, but the surface of the brain is dark. The surface of your brain and my brain is covered with darkness. That's because of our development in embryogenesis and outside of our mother's womb. And those creatures on the planet Earth with the highest level of darkness in their brain are all the great apes. And of all the great apes, the ones with the most intense are the chimpanzees and the other great apes, the gorilla and orangutan. The only great ape that has even more in their brain in critical areas is us, Homo sapiens sapien, thinking man. So there's an intimate relationship between evolutionary development and our capacity to absorb and perceive inner light. And that inner light is associated with religion, spirituality in various guises. It can be contradictory, people can fight about it, people can be in awe about it, people can go to war about it, whatever. Those are the various interpretations of that. But the perception, the human perception of light is indigenous, intricate, and intimate in all religious experiences. If you take any kind of contemplative pathway, regardless of what it is, the methodology is about meditating or praying, contemplating, whatever discipline you want to use, and contacting that inner light. And there are all kinds of meditative techniques for doing that, but as they say, as the Christ, I believe it was, said somewhere in the New Testament, I wish I knew my Bible better, but said in the New Testament, when the eye is single, the body is full of light. In other words, making your concentration very clear, your concentration and prayer very clear and single, concentrated. When that happens, your whole body is full of awe and light and energy. That is the root of all spiritual experiences, regardless of what tradition you follow. So that's that connection between light and neuromelanin and evolutionary unfoldment in our species.
And I wanted to point out that we're talking to Professor Dr. Bynum, and we're talking about the African unconsciousness. And I wanted to point out.
I want to point out one thing. I'm not a professor.
Right.
I'm a regular old psychologist. I see patients, and I deal with human beings on a regular basis, on a day-to-day basis. So that's where my experience is coming from.
Right, and we can also say you're a teacher as well. So so that's the tradition from which I'm coming from. To say that. But yes, Dr. Bynum wanted to make that. And I also wanted to make sure that, folk understand that what we're talking about here is ancient knowledge, Africans, ancient Egypt, other traditions or other communities understood the complexities and the science that you're talking about right now. And I wanted to make sure that point is made before we kind of move forward.
Oh, yes. As I said, the ancient Greeks, when they wanted to study serious medicine, they went to Egypt. The ancient Romans, when they wanted to study serious medicine at their time, they went to Egypt. Why? Because Egypt had a tradition. Egypt had been doing mummification for religious and philosophical reasons for centuries. And so they knew about the anatomy and physiology of the human body. They had books about it, and they knew the workings of the brain. They knew about the meninges of the brain, the lobes of the brain, what would happen if this part of the brain was hurt, what you would see in behavior. They even devised an early form of brain surgery called trephination. And what that was, it was induced partly by battlefield traumas. The men would be in battle and they get a splinter or brain, whatever it was, inside the brain. And trephination was literally boring into the skull and relieving pressure on the brain. So they had an early form of brain surgery. But they knew about the meninges of the brain. They knew about the nervous system. They knew about the heart in great detail. They had hundreds and hundreds of anatomical names for specific parts of the body. Plus, they raised the pyramids. They raised the obelisk, which necessitated the understanding of algebra, trigonometry, geometry. And they were quite precise. They had a calendar as accurate as our own by close to 4,500 years before Christ. They were very accurate about it. And they studied the stars. Yes. And in fact, their knowledge of medicine was not exceeded until the 18th century in Europe.
So you really lay out for us not only the, Africa is a sort of the locus for and template for human civilizations, but also the ways in which, the ancients, particularly in ancient Kemet and Nubia, really created a highly articulated form for us to understand this process of consciousness, right?
Yes,
and collective enlightenment. Can you map us through that process?
Well, one of the best known and recorded was their system of initiation. And by that I mean their method of using both the psychology of the time and the spirituality of the time to lead the practitioner, the student, through a certain phase, so they would learn to experience things that would ratify their experience. Let me give you an example. In an ancient Kemet, one would go through one's quote-unquote formal religious training, male or female. And you would study what the scriptures were at that particular time, what the leading texts are at that time. You'd have consultation with the priest and so on and so forth. If you passed those levels, then, and you were, it was agreed that you would be initiated, then you were initiated in usually one of the great temples, one of the great pyramids of the Nile. By the way, we only know today three pyramids in the Giza Plateau, but there are literally dozens and dozens of others beneath the sands that have been covered over in time that have been recently photographed by satellite technology. So there were like dozens and dozens of other pyramids that still lie underneath the sands. I just want to point that out. Anyway, so what would happen is you would be brought into the king or the queen's chamber in one of the pyramids, and you would lay down in the sarcophagus in the great pyramid, the tomb of the king's chamber or the queen's, and you would be left in there for a while. Now, if you're left in there for a while and it's absolutely dark and absolutely quiet, after a while you begin to hallucinate, and you begin to have OBEs, or what we call today in psychology and psychiatry, out-of-body experiences. An out-of-body experience is it's a form of what we call dissociation. And dissociation is where a person has the perception, autoscopic perception is the technical term, of being outside of the body. The most common experiences of this are near-death experiences, when a person is in a crisis situation and they sort of leave their body for a while. And they move down a tunnel, and there are various experiences that they have. And those that return will tell us about that experience. It's happened hundreds of thousands of times in medical emergency rooms. It's pretty well documented. Again, it's called an out-of-body experience technically, or near-death experience. Anyway, this begins to be clinically induced. I want to underline that. It is clinically induced in the sarcophagus, and the person can be in the sarcophagus for several days, and they have the out-of-body experience. Of course, they've been trained for this. They know what to expect, and so they're not terrified because, you're confronted with your own unconscious, which can be pretty frightening at times. And when they come out of this, they have experienced a second birth, and then they become part of the priesthood. And that's how they go through their particular initiation. So they use both hypnosis that we would use today and induced out-of-body experiences, which people experience today. But psychology, particularly clinical psychology and psychiatry, are very nervous about this because it suggests very clearly that the body is not the locus completely of our consciousness, but is a transitory place. People don't like that in my field. But we prove that thousands upon thousands upon thousands of times. It's just that the field doesn't know what to do with it. It just doesn't know what to do with it.
Sure. And what I wanted to kind of get us to start to think about is, you're mapping out these highly intricate psycho-spiritual and really physiological processes. And I want to kind of look at and move for us to start to think about how these psycho-spiritual processes move into other areas. So in the development of the social and political, the cultural, economic organization. Can you talk about that a little bit in your work?
Well, in my work, I focus to some extent on the ancient Kemet, West Africa, Dravidian India, and the ancient of those three, and contemporary times. And I tried very hard, and one of the criticisms of the book is that, and it's an honest criticism, is that I might have gone too far trying to substantiate everything medically and psychologically, but I wanted to put this on a very firm, solid grounding. So I was, I went to make sure I documented everything because, you have to be able to prove where all this information came from. So it begins to move into the society in ancient times because those societies were very conservative. Ancient Egypt was a very conservative society. That civilization went on for 6,000 years that we know of. 6,000 years that we know of. And there is ample evidence to suggest that there was a civilization prior to Kemet across all of Africa and all across other parts of the world also. But with a central place right there in Africa, we know about that. We have bits and pieces of data and evidence, but the most solid evidence we have, as I said at the beginning of this, is our current civilization. Our current civilization is dated back probably no more than 6,000 years before Christ, and hard evidence. There are a few exceptions. One of them are the pyramids. it is very clear that the pyramids were built at the earliest, or rather at the latest, I should say, 2,500 years before Christ, what's called the, quote, pyramid age, unquote. But there's ample evidence to indicate that they were built actually much, much, much longer ago than that. And the Sphinx, the lion-headed Sphinx with the African visage, some people say, 2,500 BC, but it's also the case, and this is what the ancient Kemetic Egyptians themselves said in their records, that the Sphinx was built 12,500 years before Christ. 12,500 years before Christ. And that Sphinx, with the body of a lion and the head of a man, an African man, looks directly into the vernal equinox, into the constellation of Leo the lion. Leo the lion on the vernal equinox, 12,500 BC. So those are the other bits of information that indicate that this religious tradition, this spiritual tradition, this cultural tradition goes way, way, way back. And as more African-rooted scholars and people who are not African necessarily, but who have an open mind and are quite curious, and there are more and more people, by the way, are acknowledging that. It's just that it hasn't reached the general public yet, because we're still preoccupied with our history of slavery and manipulation and so on and so forth. It is still a very powerful fight, unfortunately, but it will eventually pass. It will eventually pass because the evidence is too daunting. It's too much. It's just right there. It's right there. So these spiritual traditions in West Africa, which we have only touched briefly, flow into those in the African diaspora to the west. Many of the religious traditions, Santiago, Lacuma, many others that are practiced in the Caribbean and South America and so forth, have their origin in West Africa. And some of the traditions are themselves rooted in those of ancient Egypt, particularly this energy I talked about in the African unconscious of kundalini. That energy that moves up the spine in India is known as the yoga. In Kemet, in ancient Kemet, was referred to as the Uraeus serpent. But it's the same thing. Why is it the same thing? Because we have the same bodies, the same nervous system deep down. Our surface differences may be evident, but deep down, our nervous system, our brain, spinal cord, heart, the structure of our brain conduits are the same. And that's why the religious phenomenon, deep, deep, deep down, is the same.
Right, and there's so much there that I want to pull on too, especially when we talk about the Uraeus and the Kundalini energy, and also in terms of how we can take this ancient psycho-spiritual processes and actually bring them forward into our contemporary historical moment that we're experiencing right now. So much of the sort of the template of life and consciousness is manifested through light, through what you have described as neuromelanin, too, right? So how can we really translate these psycho-spiritual processes, these physiological processes, to our contemporary moment? We do have this practice of Kundalini yoga, Hatha yoga, much of the relationship to this yogic practice to ancient Egypt and ancient Kemet, as we've talked about before, has really been repressed, right? And you see in the Dravidian cultures, they have created or innovated. So what we see too is through all of these sort of like the basis really of a lot of these sort of spiritual systems, spiritual practices, articulations of religion find their principles really in ancient Egypt and ancient Kemet.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do. And it has been repressed, and it's because they're very powerful, and it was in ancient times. So this was not universal knowledge. This was actually very select in ancient times. Not everybody did it. You had to be one of the part of some particular society or priesthood, usually upper class at that ruling class time. It's actually more democratic these days. But it's there, and it's the same as it was 10,000 years ago. Why? Because we're the same creature. We may be better fed, we may be a little bit taller, but we're essentially, neurologically speaking, the same creature. So the same principles that applied back then are applied there. And anybody in any serious religious or spiritual tradition that has a contemplative or deep prayer tradition, contemplative or deep prayer condition, can find a way to awaken and guide that energy. You can feel it, and it's particularly strong. It is particularly strong in the African and African American traditions because it is not as repressed. It is not as repressed. There are hundreds across the country today of what I knew as a kid called sanctified churches, and that is where through the preacher call and response, stomping of the feet, moving of the hips, a certain way that energy was stimulated along the spinal line and awakened and moved up to the top of the head, and one was, quote, possessed, unquote, by the Holy Spirit. Well, that tradition of, quote, being possessed, unquote, is ubiquitous in West African traditions. In the traditions of Voodoo, where one is mounted by the Loa, in traditions of Middle Africa, and in many traditions throughout South America. In fact, there are some places in Brazil where the traditions are stronger than they are in West Africa. So this is all a biologically rooted phenomena. It is all a biologically rooted phenomena in all human beings. And the genius of the African traditions is that they're not buried so deep that one cannot access them. They're not. And there are many traditions and disciplines awake in the African diaspora that will lead a person to that. My only objection to some of these has been a powerful teacher or preacher can awaken the energy and rise it up very quickly, but doesn't know how to sustain it, and it goes back down. It goes back down. And so my effort has been try to elucidate this, put this in a solid medical and clinical and scientific basis, and also show the methodologies and techniques to raise it and sustain it, to sustain it. That's the goal, to sustain it, not merely rise it up, because it feels good, it's ecstatic, that's for sure, but then, one wakes up. And it is better in the long run to sustain that energy. So it pervades all of our traditions. It is the genius of our traditions. It is right there, and it's only a matter of a person deciding from whatever tradition they are already firmly rooted in, to find a way to use that tradition as a focus for that energy. And it can be done. It can be done. The thing can be done. So the African unconscious is directly related to a higher consciousness, the superconscious. Yes, the superconscious, the origin of ecstasy, creativity, insight, and our most sublime ideas. That's just not unconscious. That is superconscious. And when the African unconscious is completely awakened, one enters, it passes through waking consciousness, through higher mind, and eventually to the superconscious state. But then again, that's a different story.
So the activation of the kundalini energy, the uraeus, as the ancient Egyptians would call it, is also this linking, taking this sort of localized consciousness in the individual, and really, and then the ways that I would also characterize it would be to connect it with sort of divine consciousness, what you're talking about, this super consciousness. And
absolutely, you're right on. Absolutely true. And it can be done. It can be done. And you don't have to be a genius. You don't have to devote every minute of your waking life to do it. You have to have a discipline, an honest, sincere discipline. It is best done in a community with other people, and so that it's just safe. And share your knowledge and your information and your experiences with others. Yes, but you are absolutely correct.
So I just wanted to kind of really recap that in the sense that, so it requires and this is so important because so much of our African descendant spiritual practice or religious practice are communally based, right? They are organized around community.
Absolutely, yeah, for good reason. It helps you from getting into crazy land because you come back and you share your experiences and insights with others. And when people can consensually validate it, then you know you're on the path.
Right. So it also affirms for me just that there is to awaken and sustain this incredible energetic force, this vital life force, what, in West Africa, they also would call like Ashe, right? So this incredible life force requires in some way, shape or form, regardless of sort of the spiritual path that you decide to take, requires a structured or discipline or method or methodology for its awakening, and then it's to sustain that awakening.
That is absolutely correct. That is absolutely correct. You want to awaken the Ashe at the base of the body, bring it up through the body, through the spinal line, using various disciplines, up into all the way into the head, the Ori, the head. And when you have the Ashe from the bottom united with the Ori in the head, you have the Orisha. That's what that is. Right there in plain sight. That's what the ancient Orisha were. They were the ones who did that.
And that's incredible, especially because, the ways in which you see these natural-based, West African, earth-based spiritual practices that have been for, and one could argue have always been there, right? But there's a different level, I think, of it's recurrence, it's revival, it's always sort of been there in ways in which that there has been sort of a repression. I wanted to ask, so when
for good reason, repression. The Europeans were very frightened of it. Remember, the Haitian Revolution began in the Rada Voodoo rite, and then swept across the island. Oh yes, that's where it began. It terrified Napoleon, and since that time, that island has been sort of sealed off, economically and otherwise. We know that. That's how the Haitian Revolution began. Nat Turner's revolution began in a similar kind of situation. So yeah, there's reasons for people to be frightened of that.
Right, because we also see what is possible, right? And then one of the reasons why you see the repression or the outlying of the use of drumming, particular drums, dances.
That's right. When you do the rhythm and the dancing, there's a methodology where one is stamping one's feet, one is breathing a certain way, you're moving your hips back and forth a certain way, you're breathing a certain kind of way, and that stimulates, that movement of the hips stimulates the kundalini that is rooted at the base of the spine, and it moves her up. And it's a female energy, by the way, and it moves her up along the spinal line. The Kung people, the Kalahari in South Africa, they do the same thing as those in India. So these are all united. Why? Because we all have the same body, we all have the same nervous system, and regardless of our cultural differences on the surface, deep down we're all the same creature. And we discover that.
I did want to ask just a couple of questions as we wrap up and in closing. And thank you again so much for your time, and I really enjoyed this conversation. There are two things that I just kind of want us to think about a little bit. One is, what is the ancient future of their sort of psycho-spiritual processes for Africana communities globally? If we can, sustain these highly articulated processes that our ancestors have been engaged in for thousands of years. And then another sort of follow-up question to that is really how can organizers and activists, right, that are really active in movement building, and we see, the use of meditation and yoga, and we see the really like the return or the renewal of West African spiritual practices with Ifa, with the veneration of the Orishas. But where do you see, what can you portend for the future for Africana communities using these psychospiritual processes and understanding really and unlocking the African unconscious and moving that African unconscious to a critical consciousness?
Well, from my point of view, this is only my point of view, but there are a number of crucial events or currents going on in the world that are going to be very conducive to this. One is that, and this is a big one, and this is not a very popular one, but it is a significant one, I believe, that the Western world, meaning essentially the United States and Europe, particularly Western Europe, are in economic and political and military decline. There's no longer the hegemony that they had in the 17th, certainly 18th, 19th, and early part of the 20th century. Through wars, economic changes, and so on and so forth, they are in decline. They no longer dominate completely the geopolitical landscape. Other actors are coming on the scene. So that's one. Two, partly because of that, and partly because Africa is now in its second generation of leadership. There is not as much, shall we say, homage paid to the European economic order because it's collapsing, for one, and they're realizing that other methods and other developments are afoot. People are turning again to their own indigenous traditions and looking into what they know intuitively and on the inside, and then underlying the word, using medicine and science, particularly the clinical sciences, to explore and substantiate what they know.
That's it for Africa World Now Project for this week. I would like to thank you for joining us today and look forward to spending time with you next week. We can be reached through all your regular social media platforms. Email africaworldnowproject@gmail.com or follow us on Twitter at AFWRLDNWPRJ. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. The Africa World Now Project Collective consists of international media journalist, executive producer, and human rights activist Muizu Mutali, Africa World Now Project media correspondent Funda Ngunda, senior research, content contributor, and production director Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui, senior researcher and content contributor and production associate Dr. Josh Myers, associate producer and content contributor Dr. Keisha Khan Perry, technology advisor is Byron Gray of Grayworks Technology, and creative director is Judah Pope. Africa World Now Project is heard every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on WSNC, NPR affiliate and broadcasting service of Winston-Salem State University. Shows are archived weekly on SoundCloud. Search Africa World Now Project. Until next week, be safe, be peaceful, and above all, be intelligent.